All right, so let's get started. We're at the end of the week. We've started on our journey through the front end, starting with HTTP, going into HTML, jumping into CSS, and now we are going to discuss JavaScript, the programming language of the web. Okay. So what is JavaScript?
Not Java.
It's not Java. Spoiler alert. We've also been messing with JavaScript, right? So a lot of the beginning of the time we spent in the cohort, right? We spent doing stuff both in Ruby and in JavaScript. So we have a good idea of like what we can do with it in terms of like functions and logic stuff, right? But this is going to be your foray into what can I do with it in terms of its web presence, right? Like it is the language of the web, like that's its primary focus. It's going to be something that everybody touches, no matter whether you're like a front end or back end some person in terms of your role in the development field. Everybody is expected to have like at least touched JavaScript at least once.
So what Wally was saying yesterday, like all programmers know JavaScript.
Yeah,
it's kind of just,
it's pretty much true. Like
prevalent.
If you don't like, unless you're building like, I mean, even if you're building IoT stuff, right? Like that stuff is on the internet. Anytime you're doing anything with the web, you're most likely gonna deal with JavaScript, okay? So some quick review. We remember JavaScript looks like something like that, right? As we get into understanding the way that JavaScript's developing with ES6 and you know, how it's just continued to develop, it might look a tiny bit different from this, but for the most part, this is like basically defining a variable function that is going to do a certain thing, right? But in terms of the web, we should understand that JavaScript is an event-driven, object-oriented scripting language. Okay, so remember earlier we talked about, that'll be on the next slide, but it's a scripting language that interacts with the BOM and the DOM. We'll talk about what those are. But that's what JavaScript is, okay? It is also a language that has a lot of work to, a lot of power in terms of like asynchronous communication. It also, I mean, it's a pretty powerful language to deal with. As I mentioned, you know, if you're a developer, it's pretty positive that you've touched JavaScript at some point, okay? What it is not, as John said, it is not Java, okay? There's a lot of history around where JavaScript in its name came from. On a technical standpoint, JavaScript is actually called ECMAScript, okay? So that's why you will see ES6, it's like from ECMAScript, and ECMA is, I can't remember the acronym at the moment, we can Google it, but that's the actual language, okay? And there's like a lot of historical background of like how it kind of like wanted to be buddy-buddy with the term Java since it was so popular at the time, and that kind of thing. Also very interesting history in terms of technology, okay? So it is not Java. It is also not a toy language. That's something that many people might think of, like when you think of JavaScript, like, oh, I'm making this like cute like cat extension for people who like cats, or I'm making some like cute, you know, flash stuff, or like flashing things, or some button that bounces, right? Like it's not really just something to use for those kinds of niceties and ways to make people feel delighted. It's also a very powerful language, right? It's doing a lot of work under the hood. And lastly, it's not going anywhere. It's pretty ubiquitous. It's continuing to develop further and further, from going to be only about the browser to going into a full stack type of environment with Node.js and all that kind of thing. So it's only getting more intense to be able to utilize JavaScript for lots of things that you need to do. So just another quick reference to the different languages, right? Now we're getting into scripting language, JavaScript. And again, that is a subset of programming languages. So it is both a programming language and a scripting language. Okay, so I mentioned BOM and DOM. So this is a really good visual understanding of what I mean by BOM. BOM stands for Browser Object Model, okay? So as we touch our web browser, right, it's actually holding onto a few layers of stuff that's going on. And when we deal with the browser, we're really just talking to what is called, in terms of its object, a window. Okay, so you'll see that as we start working with JavaScript in the web, on the web, we're going to be like asking for the window object to do a thing. Okay, that's where that comes from. You'll see further down something that looks pretty familiar when it comes to what we were dealing with earlier this week. Body, links, like an A tag, right? Forms, fields, that's the content layer. That's the actual HTML that's happening, right? And then, as I mentioned, we're working, when we have an HTML document, we're working with a document that's being interpreted by the browser, right? So that brings us to the next part. The DOM is something that stands for Document Object Model, okay? So not only are we dealing with the window, which is like the browser in a whole, we're also dealing with the scope of that page that you're looking at is actually an object model in terms of JavaScript that you would be able to interact with particular to that document. Okay. So something next to it, which we'll also be dealing with, is events. So that kind of alludes to when I just mentioned JavaScript being an event-driven language. Okay. We would be interacting with how those events fire up things that are going on that document. Okay, so the last thing I'll just note is that the document object model is not just reading a document and letting it just sit there passively. It is creating a model object that works like a node tree. And knowing that we're dealing with an object just like we've been dealing with objects in Ruby, okay? It has some functionality. It has, you know, children, parents, that kind of thing. Your ability to use like dot notation the way you've been using dot notation with other objects in JavaScript will come into play here, just as it did when we're dealing with like node on the back end, quote unquote, okay? So this is actually what ends up happening when your HTML code gets translated and interpreted into a document object model. Okay. So the things that we get when we play with JavaScript in the web. JavaScript is allowing us to traverse that document object model node tree. So we know that we can get to the parents and the children and the attributes within that object. It's really giving us a language to do that kind of work. Okay. Additionally, it allows us to manipulate those objects. So now, you know, just the same way we change an attribute's value from one thing to the next, now we can utilize JavaScript to change HTML elements from, you know, in terms of its attributes or in terms of, you know, what element type it is or whether we want it to be showing or hidden, that kind of stuff, right? Allows us to make changes to the node tree as it stands. JavaScript also allows us to react and pun on actual React, right? And we're not talking about literal React at this point, but it does allow us to react to events that are created by the user or created by us to listen to them, right? And then when events happen from users' activity, we can make decisions about what we want our document to do based on those events happening. JavaScript allows us to animate really cool stuff, communicate things, and that's what we'll get into next week when we start talking about jQuery and Ajax. JavaScript really gives us that ability to deal with web APIs to do this kind of work, making, GET requests and all that kind of stuff. And then lastly, JavaScript allows us to persist information. And we'll see that play out both on the small playing field of dealing with web APIs like browser storage or session storage, to larger things when we deal with like React as an entire framework that helps us navigate the persistence of data on the client side without having to deal with a server side data structure. Okay. So some functions that you will start to see. We'll be calling these two top pieces quite a bit. So we'll be able to call on the document object to do things like get an element by its ID, get query selector using the CSS selectors that we already have started understanding how to call and use. We can query selector all, so like get all the things with these various selector attributes. Okay, we can create elements into the node tree that didn't exist before when the node tree was built from the like GET requests that we get from the server, right? We can make things onto that document. Additionally, we can like append children from a given node tree element, which is useful when you start thinking about the ways that you like add a new item to your shopping cart, or remove an item from a to-do list, or pop a few extra things onto your checkout carts. Okay, those are all things that are being powered by JavaScript in some form of another, utilizing these kinds of methods. Okay, additionally, if I have an individual element object, I can do some things like ask for it to enter HTML. I can do things like change an attribute that that element might have going on with it, changing the style, animating it to like fade in and out, or rotate, that kind of stuff. I can also add event listeners, so that HTML element might be interactive to a user in terms of like an anchor link has like an automatic click functionality to it, right? Like, what if I want to just watch and wait until somebody clicks on it and then do something about that? Okay, those would be adding event listeners utilizing JavaScript. But how do I do that? What do y'all think? Spoiler alert, HTML and CSS, you're still going to have to use it, right? It's JavaScript, you're not just going to be like, I'm going to make JavaScript by itself, right? You still have to interact with the DOM, which includes HTML elements. You're still going to have to deal with CSS selectors. So you can't just, we're not just dropping them and leaving them in, front-end design land. We're actually going to be utilizing them more and more.
I'm just curious how it kind of works in real life, because like we talked about there, like UI, UX designers and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They usually like design some kind of like style sheet, like here's all the things how we want them to look, and then you go in and like add all the stuff afterwards, like to make them do all the cool stuff. Are someone like kind of in between, like actually building out the HTML and CSS to make it look like something they've designed, like graphic design wise or something?
Yeah, good question. I think it really depends, which is my favorite answer to everything, but depends on the team. So that is a very similar it's a very familiar process, I feel, for people to, we have a designer that's like, I'm going to envision what I should expect the user to be able to see, and I might imagine like they should be able to have this kind of experience. I know that this implementation exists. It might exist in multiple ways, and I'm going to leave it to the developers to make the best choice of how that's implemented. But I should expect that when I do this event, this happens, and then leave the implementation details to the developer. And then you might also have another level of somebody building the framework, right, of the HTML pieces, and being able to create a guide that says, these are the class names we're using, these are the CSS styles we're using, so here's the framework. And then another person would be like, okay, let me take these components and animate them either by adding event listeners or doing that kind of thing.
And you can have probably people that are good at a lot of those types of things, but like in your weekly Scrum kickoff or like whatever it is called, like where you like take the stories you're going to work on. They kind of like sort those things out then, or
yeah, I think
Agile-wise or whatever it is.
I could see that happening that way. I know in my experience, that was definitely a part of it. We had a designer that was like, okay, you know, as a team, we're all working on this one feature. You know, like I will get you all these level of designs by this date. You can start working on like what components are going to be necessary. Like we know we're going to need an HTML page, or we know we're going to need, you know, these kinds of container pieces. You know, and then we'll match it together towards the end or something and make sure it all works together.
Cool. Is literally designers like literally creating a bootstrap for that website, bootstrap style.
So that could be from either like a front end designer doing that or front end developer doing that to like a designer only thinking about like the optics of it or optics of what that looks like, and then some in between of the, you know, developer that's implementing it to
translating the pretty picture into like actual code.
Right. Or like, yeah. So it could go in any of those formats. Somebody might say like, I have an image here, but I actually need to translate that into an SVG or stuff like that. Like, so there's a variation. It really depends on what you're trying to implement. But those are all good, like, insights into how that might work in a larger team. So the implementation steps for how you might see this stuff actually work out in terms of you actually building something, right? The first thing you would want to do is make sure that you can select the HTML elements and understand that when I call this thing, I'm going to hold it into a variable, you know, after querying that selector and getting it into a like one thing, right? The next step would be you can manipulate those elements. So I know I can call all the list items and then do something to those list items. Pretty straightforward, right? Alternatively, you might see more of like a three-step process where the first thing you do is you make sure that you know what elements you're selecting. You create an event listener on that collection or that one element that you've selected, and then you're building a function that would run upon the trigger of that event that you set an event listener on. So one example you might see if we go again through that idea of an anchor tag, right? You have an on-click event. So you have an on-click event, right? So I know that when somebody clicks on this link, I want something to happen. You know, maybe there's some like applause that happens or something gets added to another part of the page, something like that. A color gets changed, anything like that, right? So I'm making a function that happens upon that event. Okay, so you can do it in either inline. It can be called inline on the HTML, or it can be called in JavaScript by setting an event listener in JavaScript. So earlier when I mentioned add event listener, there's an actual method called add event listener where the first argument is the event itself, so click, and then the function is like the do something part, right? Change the color. And then that change color function would be something you would build beforehand. The event listener would just sit there and wait until the event happened, okay, on that element.
So since we can do in the HTML, why we can use like JavaScript to do like that?
Good question. So if we wanted to, so the example I gave was using the function called add event listener, right? If we didn't use add event listener and we put the function directly on the HTML elements living in the HTML, what would happen is as the DOM as the document was being read, it would actually immediately fire off this function. Okay, and you'll notice that you sometimes don't want that to happen because you need another piece of the document to have been loaded in order for that function to actually make sense, right? Like maybe the list item or the ordered list element that you want to make a change to doesn't exist on that page yet. So you just fired off an event on something to change something that doesn't exist yet on the page. So it's going to act as if nothing happened, right? The user's not going to be able to see that.
So let's say you put in HTML first and then you have them just add that like.
So JavaScript is typically, I mean, people have different styles for how they're going to want to do that. You know, if you think like, I have an idea where I want to build a clock, right? You might build some of the functionality, like I should expect that, you know, a change the time function works this way. I'll build that change the time function first. And then I'll create an add event listener or a, you know, a create, a query selector line of code in my JavaScript that says like, I should expect that when I build this like dot clock and I get this kind of action, it should fire off the change the clock event, right? And then from there I might say, okay, now I need to make sure that I have a clock class element that will be listened to, and then I'll build it out like that. And then I'll double check that it works and make sure there's some console log statements inside my function to make sure that when I load my screen that it actually is listening to the, for the event and that kind of stuff. So it really depends on how, like what order you want to do something in. But you are going to need CSS, HTML, and JavaScript for all together for that kind of stuff to work. So again, some of the actions that typically happen on a page are on click, on hover, on scroll, on focus, on change, which will look at whether something has changed on the screen. So whether that's like adding text or removing text, on key up or key down. So when a person is typing particular keys, there's a lot of different events that could be firing. So there's a really good documentation for all the different events. You can also build custom events. Okay, the last thing I'm going to note here is that JavaScript works really well with a varying, like huge number of web APIs. So there's like a large set of web APIs that JavaScript can take advantage of. A few here that I mentioned are really interesting to kind of like jump into and read. You're actually going to utilize some of them in the challenges today. Browser storage and session storage let you store things in the browser. So earlier we talked about HTTP saving cookies, for example. Those are being saved on the browser, right, as cookies. You have larger ones called sessions. You have a navigator, which tells you like the page that came before you, the page that that you can go to after, that kind of thing. There's also the console itself is an actual web API. So when you're in the browser's console, that's like its own object. And then you have a fetch API, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's one API that lets you do AJAX calls and other kinds of like promise things. So that's the presentation-y part so far. I'm going to pause the recording and then jump into an example for how, like a simple example for how JavaScript is utilized. Let me. All right, cool. So now let's take a little bit of time to look at like a hello world example for utilizing JavaScript. Okay, so we have a set of HTML here on the left side. We have all of our code wrapped in a body tag, right? Wrapped in a body tag. We have an H1 heading that has an ID of heading 1. And then we have this script tag here. So one thing I didn't note is that similar to the style element in HTML, you have a script element, right? So you can write JavaScript both embedded in an HTML page or separately, as we did with CSS, and then make sure that we are linking to that, that JavaScript on another file, okay?
So what's preferred? Because I've seen some of the challenges I pulled it and it was in there and I was
like having a separate file?
I think that the preferred, like your adoption of it will, you know, you're going to have larger files, a larger code base. So you're going to see a lot of external JavaScript files. But for this example, it doesn't make sense to do the extra work of creating a new file if you're just going to have like 4 lines of JavaScript, right? So in those cases, it's just like throw it at the bottom and let it work. Okay, so for this example, we have var text equals, so this is the code I was mentioning, get element by ID. And then we have a selector here, heading 1. Note, I'm not using a hashtag here. Can anybody tell why?
Because we're HTML.
Well, we're in
CSS,
JavaScript
right?
at this point because we're in a script tag.
Yep.
But the function I'm using explicitly says get the element by its ID, right? Alternatively, you have a function called get element by name or get element by class, okay? So you can utilize the most appropriate function for what you're actually trying to select. And then the newer JavaScript is you're utilizing document.querySelector. And then in that case, you would utilize like dot or hashtag or the larger CSS selector to get whatever it is that you need from your document, okay? So this first line is saying, save this variable called text as whatever gets returned, like the element that gets returned when I query or go get the element by ID named heading -1, okay? Now we have our text element object. So then in line 5, we're saying, okay, element, so we have our text element object dot text content. So here we're using the function to set the text content as some value. And we're setting it to hello world.
On that one, is text content similar to our HTML?
It's similar, but I think it has a slightly different option because we can Google the difference between inner HTML and text content. One thing that that's probably alluding to is some HTML elements don't have text-based content.
Oh, okay.
So that might be where the differentiation lies. Okay, but we'll verify that after this. Cool? Okay, so we're going to create this script and then we're going to run it, right? So in order for me to run this, all I have to do is open it in the browser. Oh, why aren't you getting my open in the browser thing?
When you like it, and I go for it.
Do we need
Do
any like
you have
the,
PTM now?
do we need any of the HTML like wrapper tags or anything like that stuff?
That might be why the open in browser thing is not working.
But it should work, just
But it
like
should.
it is, right?
So I'm just going to do that. And then I'm just going to throw this junk into my HTML thing and see if that's not why. Yeah, that must be why.
So it's just like Sublime Text is little.
Yeah,
That's
it's
why it
like,
decides
this is not an HTML
it's a
document that I can show in the browser.
Just
Fine.
the doc type one?
It was probably the doc type or the, so this is the result of that, right? So notice, in my actual code, in the body, there's nothing here. Make sense? Additionally, I could probably say, go, and then, right, it changed it. So if I do Command Option I here, yeah, it might have just been like super hella fast. And if you wanted to double check that, right, we can go to network and then we can change the way this gets sent to be like super slow, and then see whether or not that that changes. Okay, but right, so the JavaScript is actually saying like, make sure the text content for this element is this. So we set it in JavaScript, not in HTML. Okay. So getting used to that behavior of select it, then modify it. Select it, then modify it. Okay, that'll come into play. So the interactivity comes into play when we start dealing with things that have events, right? So what might be an item that we would use that would have an event on it? A button, yes. So let's play with the buttons in our HTML and throw a button on there. Okay, so let's see. We have button tag. Okay, and then I think the content here is just like beep, beep, beep. Okay, so if I refresh this, I have this little, okay, so I have this little thing over here, boop, 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 boop. Right? Now, one thing I will show you is that in here, you have your elements tab, and then you have this secondary tab going on. The first is, these are all the styles that were listed to show this browser. The second one is, these are the computed styles that actually got rendered to the page, right? And I can also go in here and say, like, this is the size of my element, this is the padding, border, and there's the margin, right? I can also go to event listeners. Properties. Okay, properties is also going to tell me, like, what are all the things that are going on here. So if I highlighted this button, do I have an event listener? I don't. So let's do something with this button. So we're going to add an alert that says something when somebody clicks this button. Right? Let's figure out how to do that. So what would be the step we would need to take to make that happen? So I showed you one example in the presentation I did.
You can do on click.
Right. So we can do on click. Oops, not in click, on.
Yeah, you should just say somewhere you can just run. You can actually just run the function, right?
Right. Can't remember right now if it's this or that, but we'll start with that. So I just named the function do something, right? So what would be the JavaScript that I would need to write?
Function do something, does something.
Okay, so do something equals function. And then in this case, I mentioned we're going to make an alert, right? So it's just alert. Semicolon. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So right now, when I run this, what do we think is going to happen? Hopefully it works. Something better happen. Did anything happen? Did a thing. We all did a thing. Success to us. All right. So what we did was we, on that element, made an event that on click, something should happen, right? The do something function. And our do something function, all it did was just say like make an alert, right? That's going to show us something. Okay, cool. So that's generally how that's going to happen. Okay, alternatively, you can add event listener to, and you would add it on an item. So for example, here we have our text here. So you can say text.add event listener. You can say hover. What, we can make another function.
Does if we hover?
We'll say change color. Cool. And then here we'd want to create var change color. This function. Let's do that real quick. So something I'm using here is, so this add event listener is going to like capture the event here, and then we're going to console log what's happening. Okay. Oh, should probably do that. Is this clickable? Maybe not. This is. Notice it says, so index.html, line 19. Ah, what do y'all think is happening here? Are you confused or intrigued? This is something that you'll probably learn within this next week.
Shouldn't that execution be on like on hover or something? Or is that just that does that? That does the hover?
Oh. We could also, yeah, we could totally look at the documentation real quick and see. So add event listener hover. Oh, mouse over. So that might actually be what we need to use, right? Not hover. So in this example, the same, we have the same thing, right? Var text, but var test document get element by ID. And then we're going to add event listener, mouse enter.
How would it work if we put a function?
Event. Okay, cool. So there's two things that will change. So we're going to add this, mouse enter, and then change color event. Okay, and some other document stuff. And then eventually we'll get to this part here, right? So let's reload based on what we have. Okay. Okay. Mouse enter is not working the way that we expected, is it? Mouse over function event. Let's see how this one works.
You want mouse over or mouse enter?
Well, we'll try that first. Mouse over, right? Mouse over, and then change color event, and then var change color is a function where it takes the event, and then we should console log that event. So click me works. The whole world is not doing anything. Okay. Let's try it this way. But it couldn't be a named function or an anonymous function. Question. Let's start our body here. What happened? So console, you should be able to ask for, like, right here, for example, I can write console log. Right? Okay, so yeah, you can call console.log directly. You can ask for the console directly. There's some other cool stuff you can do with console I definitely recommend you checking out that can be really useful when we start dealing with larger elements.
Is that Chrome dependent, or is it any browser that has like a console object?
Console object is pretty ubiquitous to browse, like for multiple browsers.
I guess any browser using JavaScript, right?
Yeah, the web API is larger than just the browser, but Chrome DevTools, sometimes it has some like quirks that are more useful in terms of like console that you can use that other browsers might not be able to use. Like I haven't had a lot of experience in like messing with the console in terms of Safari, for example, or I don't even have it in Internet Explorer, but
Edge.
Yeah, Microsoft Edge. But yeah, but there's an equivalent of like being able to utilize console in just about any browser. Okay. So let's see, this example they had here was with these different items. You can just read through the code, right? We have our console log. We're setting, we're getting a selector, get element by ID. We're adding an event listener to that element. Where on mouse enter, something's going to happen. So on that event, the targeted event, we're changing the style of that element, particularly the color of that element, to purple. And then it should reset the color. So this is a set timeout function that, if you hadn't already seen it, will move that. It'll just utilize that function for a set amount of time and then revert back to the beginning. So change the style color back to its original color. Okay. And then we also have the orange one. So let's see that working. Sure it should. Yeah. So yeah, and you can definitely read more about like the difference between mouse over, hover, right? Mouse enter. The same thing will happen with a lot of other kinds of element events that you can utilize on different elements, right? Some elements might have particular kind of events that you could take advantage of, like the anchor tag, for example, right? Cool. Okay, so that's a really good explanation for how that works. The rest of today's challenges are going to focus on just getting used to being able to look at JavaScript, get back into like understanding that the console is here for you and that you can utilize various documentation resources like Mozilla's Dev Center to get more acquainted with events and the DOM object and element objects. Cool. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here. And then y'all have the rest of the day to work on JavaScript stuff and finish up as much as you can on the other pieces.